It's commonly speculated with young quarterbacks who's going to be successful, who isn't going to be successful, all of that good stuff. And, kind of the conversation always seems to go, there's some sort of discussion of, okay, well, how good have you been so far? But also, how young are you? That's kind of the two things that always get brought up. And so a couple years ago, actually, I kind of created a formula for how well do you do in PFF grades what I use. That's something I found to be the best indicator of future success. So how well did you do in terms of Pro Football Focus grades, and how does that translate to how likely you are to be successful at the next level? I created this algorithm, and so every year I have gone back, entered the players in the algorithm, and see what comes up of the players that were drafted within the past 3 seasons. So we're going to go through everyone who was drafted, who, there's a couple players who have, like I didn't include Davis Mills on the list, but, players who I feel like are, the most notable players that were drafted. How have they performed, according to the algorithm? Let's just get into it. So first, let's start off with the guys who were just drafted this past season. We got Kenny Pickett, Brock Purdy, Bailey Zappi, Sam Howell, Desmond Ridder, and Malik Willis are the 6 I'm including. Matt Corral did not play, so not including him. But, you have to play to make the list. But, best are closest towards the top. So Kenny Pickett and Brock Purdy both had a good enough PFF grade to put them in position to where the actual average player that is graded as well as Purdy and Pickett were graded ends up being a great NFL quarterback. Again, great, good, some value, and bust are the 4 categories from left to right. And the number you see, that's what percentage of players who graded in the same bracket that player graded in end up being, as good. So, for example, for Kenny Pickett, players who graded in the same bracket that he did in his rookie year, about 60% were great, 20% were good, 0% had some value, and 20% were bust. And this is, my own subjective opinion on how those players ended up. So, same thing for Purdy. Sam Howell and Bailey Zappi, again, small sample size for some of these guys, but they both ended up in the tier that makes, on average, good. You see about 40% were great, 20% good, 40% some value. Not really any bust in that category, but also not as high of a likelihood of being great either, but still you're on the right track if you're in that range. As for Desmond Ridder and Malik Willis, it's actually very rare for players who ended up in that tier to go on to have great seasons. And I only included guys who were drafted in the first couple rounds in the algorithm here. So it's not like there's just a bunch of 7th rounders who only played a couple snaps and that's why it was the case. No, it's just typically when you play that well, you don't end up being that great. In fact, over 60% would end up being a bust. Now, again, both of those guys had very small sample sizes. I think that's an important distinction to make as, how fair was their grade really? Maybe they were actually better than that grade if they had a full season to play, but just weren't able to do that. So, again, this is just what the past has said about players who play that well. Maybe the PFF grade is wrong in certain players' cases. There's many reasons why it could be the case, but it's just interesting to look at, I think. So as a whole, optimistic for Purdy and Pickett. I would say still optimistic for Howell and Zappi, and maybe not so great looking for Ridder and Willis. As for the players drafted 2 years ago in the very hyped up NFL draft class, Fields and Lawrence are interesting. Where they've graded, actually, it's pretty scattered. Around 25% across the board ended up, in each category. So there really isn't an average in this scenario. I guess you could argue it's split between good and some value, but it really feels like they're complete wild cards from where they graded. Although I think it's important to note as well, again, I did this in brackets of 10 points according to PFF grades, and Lawrence was just a couple points away from being in the next bracket, so he was very close to being in a much higher bracket. Fields actually had the opposite. He just barely made that bracket, so while him and Lawrence technically are in the same bracket, again, you have to kind of group things together a little bit to get enough of a sample size. You can't use literally every single point, but then because of that, it can be a little bit misleading there as well. So I would say there's a higher likelihood than just 25% chance Lawrence ends up being great. I would say that. McCorkle, Mac Jones, he ends up projecting for some value, which again, I'm not taking their entire career into account, only their past season. That's also an important distinction to make. So for McCorkle, yeah, guys who perform as he did last year typically end up not being just complete bust and out of the league, but like some value. Think of like a backup tends to be, that's how I would consider some value, or maybe a very low tier starter. But again, you could argue that the PFF grade was unfair for Jones given the situation that he was put in and the Matt Patricia of it all. As for Zach Wilson and Trey Lance, it's not looking great for either of them, although I would say, again, Trey Lance, I do think there's another asterisk there just due to the small sample size. He barely played. So while yes, guys who performed as poorly as he did typically don't end up being successful, usually you get a lot more playing time, and it can be misleading when you only have a couple of games, and that can go in positive or negative directions. But for him, due to the small sample size, I'm not as concerned about it as I am for like someone like Zach Wilson, who I'm just convinced is probably going to be a bust at this point. For Lance, I'm willing to still give him some potential hope that he could get better than just that. And last but not least, the guys drafted 3 years ago have had a really good hit rate, and a lot you feel very optimistic about. Guys like Burrow, Hurts, and Tua all have graded well enough to be in a bracket of they're probably going to be great. Like that's typically what you expect from guys who are that good after year 3. About 75% end up being great, and the other ones tend to still be very good. So you feel pretty good about those guys. The other two, Herbert and Love. Herbert, again, another one of those guys very close to that top bracket with the other three. I think he was just slightly below, and he has been he has posted grades that would be in that top bracket in years past. Just it was a down year PFF grade-wise for him. But even so, still the highest likelihood is that he would be great, and the average still ends up being good. Good or better. Jordan Love is in this bracket as well. Again, small sample sizes can work in both ways, right? Small sample sizes can work in positive or negative ways, but PFF was relatively impressed with Jordan Love enough to put him in this bracket, which means he's projecting to still be good, although I would want to wait a full season before I really, make too strong of opinions one way or the other on Love. So what does this tell us? Well, I think it's a good idea to give us kind of a baseline of what happens with the future and kind of how we should feel about these players, not necessarily comparing them to, it's hard to get a big sample size with this stuff. So comparing them to as big of a sample size as we can get can help us get a bit of a better idea of how this works. And again, maybe I could use a bigger sample size to even get more data behind some of this stuff. But I'm always a little weird about that because like if you go too far back, it was a different sport at that point, and it's not really totally fair. So I kind of got to do what you can do with this stuff. But yeah, I mean, as a whole, is there any like decision I would make differently after looking at this chart? Not really, no. I guess I feel a little better about Jordan Love, but it's such a small sample size, I don't really care that much. Maybe I feel a little worse about Trey Lance, but it's such a small sample size, I don't really care that much. Maybe I feel a little bit worse about Lawrence, but again, he was so close to that next higher bracket. I really don't. I think he was pretty close to that. Honestly, I feel pretty similar about all these players as I already did, before looking at the graph, but maybe some of you felt differently. And I mean, I guess the one thing I would say is I think I feel much better about Kenny Pickett and Brock Purdy now. Maybe that's the one thing I would, point towards, but I like them anyway. So I don't know. It's an interesting exercise, but I don't know if I would make any, if I'm running a team, I don't know if I would change anything because of it. Just more of a fun thing to look at is kind of how I view it. But yeah, that's what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. What are your thoughts on all of this? Do you disagree with the chart in some ways? And again, just because that's what the average does, doesn't mean that that player will also be, just because I believe Jalen Hurts was, scheduled to be a bust after year 1. So definitely doesn't always work out, but sometimes it does, and usually it does. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. Always love hearing from ya. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.